Bond 25 has been delayed yet again. It's now going to be released, apparently, on April the 8th, 2020, which sounds like a decent release date, I'm sure, but it's already been delayed before. Bond 25 was initially due for a release in October of 2019, but then it was delayed to February the 14th, 2020. This was a delay I could accept because it was a short delay. If you have to do a delay, make it as short as humanly possible. This was a pretty short delay, only a few months. Fine. We've already waited a pretty long time. Fine. Okay? It's fine. The biggest problem is this delay, because it's another delay. It shows the absolute uncertainty and confusion surrounding the production of this movie. The movie, it was supposed to, be released this October and November in America, as is tradition for Bond films. And somehow we're in a position now where the next Bond film won't be released until April of 2020. Now, the last Bond film, Spectre, whatever you thought of it, and a lot of people have opinions on that movie, was released in October of 2015, and obviously November 2015 in America. By the time Bond 25 is released, it will have been nearly 5 years since the last Bond film, which is absolutely insane. Normally, when there's a big gap between Bond films, there's some sort of an excuse. There were financial problems, legal problems, there were legal difficulties between the gap between License to Kill in 89 and GoldenEye in 95. That's a good example, that's a gap I could accept. Yes, it's painful and laborious, but it's a gap which is acceptable. It's not ridiculously long. The gap between Casino Royale... No, that's not right, sorry. The gap between Quantum of Solace and Skyfall was 4 years. Quantum of Solace came out in 2008, Skyfall came out in 2012. That's an acceptable gap, because there were financial problems with MGM, one of the companies on the Bond films. So that made perfect sense, and actually it tied in perfectly to the 50th anniversary. Then there were 3 years between Skyfall and Spectre, which was alright. That was actually quite quick, considering the logistical nightmare that must come with making a Bond film. But now we're in a position where Bond 25 will be released, unless it's not delayed again, on April the 8th, 2020. And that's ridiculous. That's nearly 5 years between films, and they only really started getting this production going, in sort of 2017. Honestly, Mission Impossible is a good example of how you can do a spy franchise and you can do films, reasonably regularly. There was I'm not overly familiar with the Mission Impossible franchise, but they did a film in 2018, obviously. They did a film in 2015, which was the same year Spectre came out. So Mission Impossible they've done another film quite a bit earlier than the Bond franchise, effectively their main rivals. And it could be an example of maybe the Bond franchise losing energy, maybe even losing relevance in this ever-changing movie landscape. Now, I'm not suggesting the Bond franchise should become sort of a cinematic universe like Marvel or DC or even Star Wars. Of course not. Bond should always have one film at a time every few years, but one film every 4 or 5 years is absurd. This is supposed to be Daniel Craig's final film, okay? By the time he leaves in 2020, he will have done 5 films. That's 5 films since 2006. I mean, that's ridiculous. Honestly, I can't even stress that there needs to be greater regularity and there needs to be greater planning into these movies in advance. It's like Spectre was released in 2015, and we all have opinions on that movie. We all have a variety of thoughts on that, but Spectre was released, and it's like the producers and everyone involved in the production just kind of didn't do anything for ages. Everyone else, or the actors went off and did other things, of course, but it's like the producers just kind of sat on their hands for about 2 years before doing anything at all. It's actually ridiculous. I mean, before there used to be Bond video games in between to, keep you going in between the releases of the main movies, but there's not even that, because there hasn't been a Bond video game, I think, since 2012, which was, I think, 007 Legends. Again, I'm not familiar with the 007 video games, I'm not much of a gamer myself, but it's just not really appealing to the fans. Star Wars, at the very least, while it's definitely got people talking, at least they have films fairly regularly, and that's probably never going to stop. Even if they miss out 2020, which is highly possible, there will always be a Star Wars film on the horizon. What's happened to Bond? I mean, honestly, there used to be a time where Bond films could happen every 2 to 3 years. Now, I understand that making Bond films are incredibly logistical, they're very tricky, you can't just patch it over with CGI, you have to film it in real time with actually there and not in some studio. You have to do it on location somewhere. It's a complete it's a nightmare to make, really. But the fact that Mission Impossible, which is also a spy franchise, can make films far more regularly and have got more films planned, I think in 2020, 2021. By the time 2021 comes around, we will have just had Bond 25. We won't have had another one, obviously. So it's not even a case of, oh, it's a spy genre, let them take their time. It's a case of, Mission Impossible, also a spy franchise, can do it much more quickly. So this is a bit of a rant, I accept, and if you're still listening, then congratulations. But it's just kind of frustrating if you're a fan of the Bond films, as I am, to have to wait for ages. Now, there is this argument that if you wait, and, patience is a virtue. Your patience will be rewarded. Don't you worry. Don't you worry about one little thing. It'll be rewarded. Is frankly absurd. It's ridiculous. I mean, there is a compelling argument to suggest that there should be gaps between movies so audiences don't get burnt out by the content. We've kind of seen that with Star Wars, and they're going to slow down, but they're not going to slow down to the extent of James Bond. They're going to do like every 5 years. And there hasn't been Bond films released every 2 to 3 years for quite a long time now. It's not really since the Brosnan era where regularly, it'll be every 2 3 years. Yes, there was Casino Royale, and then 2 years later was Quantum of Solace, but Quantum of Solace is terrible. It's one of the worst films in the franchise, so that's not a very good example of let's do it every sort of 2 years. And it's just irritating how it's like the producers don't really know what they're doing, and people are now thinking maybe the Broccoli's, Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli should just hand the film over to a new generation of producers who have some energy and some passion for what they're doing. It's like they're just kicking the can down the road and don't really want to commit to making the film. Now, I think the original delay was the whole director dispute problem when they had to get rid of where Danny Boyle was sacked. And they got the new director, whose name I can't pronounce, in. I don't know what this delay is about. I mean, Daniel Craig's recently become a father, so maybe he's trying to get into shape for the film, but frankly, it's ridiculous. I mean, you can do action fit films stuff much quicker than this. They should have planned this. Frankly, as soon as Spectre finished, they looked at the pretty decent box office numbers. They did pretty well at the box office, about 800 million, which is pretty good. That's definitely promising, at least. Not as much as Skyfall, but good. They should have got straight to work and started work on some sort of a sequel. Not a direct sequel, not some cinematic universe building thing, which didn't work with Spectre, but just another film, a Bond 25. And, I mean, I don't really know what my point is, what point I'm trying to make here, but it's so frustrating, thinking these Bond films take ages to make. I understand they're difficult to make, you don't do them in the studio, you do them out in the real world. And it's very, hard, but honestly, Bond films can be good and released on a reasonably regular basis, and it's a bit unfortunate. And if you're a proper hardcore Bond fan, it's like your absolute passion, then all you've had to do really is rewatch the last 24 official films, and there's not been any fresh material for ages. And yeah, so I don't know what my point is, but basically, it's irritating that the film has been delayed and everything like that. And I think the producers really need to have a game plan, a bit of a strategy as what they're doing. They didn't seem to have any idea what they're doing. So I haven't really got a conclusive point. Like, by the way, James Bond, do this. Producers, do this. I haven't got any kind of positive message. It's not like they haven't even said. They tweeted out, a few hours ago, as of making this video, a tweet saying, we are absolutely thrilled to be releasing Bond 25 on the 8th of April 2020. Presumably there'll be a slightly earlier UK date, but still, maybe the 1st of April, maybe it's a joke, this whole film. I mean, honestly, It's ridiculous. No Bond has ever left on a really, really good film or a pretty good film, except from Timothy Dalton, who left on License to Kill, which I think is a very underrated movie. Now, I'm not saying this movie is going to suck, but the fact there's been now 2 delays doesn't really speak, doesn't exactly imbue confidence on the part of the film. So, this is a bit of a rant. It's entirely unscripted. I've just been moaning about Bond 25 having a release date that's a bit too far away for my liking, and it's I've said it all. I've been ranting for now 10 minutes or so, so I'm going to stop now. Thank you for listening, if you're still here, to my bonkers rants. If you want to watch my other videos, which they aren't all rants, I don't usually do rants. This is an exception. I don't usually do rants. Then please subscribe and hit the bell if you want to check out my other videos. They are truly groundbreaking stuff, trust me. So, yeah, thank you for listening.